Elias Thorne swung his axe again, the silence of the high valley broken only by the sharp thwack of steel on pine and the distant whining shriek of the wind. It was October 1847, in the hardscrabble foothills of the Colorado Rockies. The air was already thin and sharp, carrying the metallic threat of an early, unforgiving winter. Elias, a man of 35 years, lean and weathered as the granite peaks above him, was building. He was a trapper by trade, but a carpenter by necessity, and he was working with a desperate, hurried energy. He was cutting wood for a new structure, but his gaze kept shifting to the crude, existing lean-to he'd occupied for a year, a structure that had nearly been his tomb. That first cabin, built like every other trapper's shelter in the territory, was a failure. He could feel its failure in his bones, a lingering chill that had never left him since the great thaw in March. He remembered the ice, not the ice on the river or the frost on the panes of glass he'd packed in, but the ice inside his cabin. He remembered waking in the dead of January, his beard stiff with frozen breath, to find a rime of frost coating his blankets, only 5 feet from a roaring fire. The fireplace, a massive, imposing structure of river stone and mud, was the heart of the problem. It was a walk-in hearth, built on the common-sense principle that a bigger fire meant a bigger warmth. It was a lie. The fire roared, a hungry, bellowing demon that devoured the cords of pine and aspen he'd spent his summer cutting. It lit the cabin with a flickering, hellish light, but it offered no comfort. All the heat, all that glorious, life-giving heat, went straight up the wide, gaping chimney flue, pulling the cold air in with it. The cabin was a study in violent contrasts. To stand before the fire was to have your face scorched and your back frozen. The drafts were not gentle breezes. They were physical, cutting winds that snaked through the unseasoned, shrinking log walls. They made the single candle flame dance wildly and carried the acrid smell of pine smoke into every corner. Ash settled on his food in his water pail. He was living in a smokehouse that was colder than the outside. He had been a slave to that hearth, his days measured not by the sun but by the woodpile. He spent half his waking hours feeding it, and the other half freezing. He'd survived, but barely. He had watched other, less prepared men in these mountains fail. He'd found their frozen shacks, the woodpiles gone, the hearths cold. This new winter, he vowed, would be different. He was not just building a cabin. He was staging a quiet rebellion against the common sense that was killing men. The wind picked up, carrying the first stinging needles of sleet. Elias paused, wiping his brow with a frozen sleeve. He looked at the pile of fresh logs, their resinous scent sharp in the cold. He would build this one right. But as he looked at the stones he'd begun to gather for the new hearth, a deep unease settled on him. He could build the walls tighter, chink them with more care, set the roof with a steeper pitch. But the fire? He still didn't understand the fire. If he built the same hearth, he would only be building a more expensive, better-looking coffin. He had to change the heart of the shelter itself. That first winter had been a long, agonizing education in the flaws of traditional design. Elias had arrived in the valley in the spring of 1846, following the rumors of untouched beaver streams. He'd built his cabin quickly, eager to get his trap lines set before the snows. He followed the exact methods his father had taught him back in Ohio, the same methods every settler used. He'd chosen a stand of tall lodgepole pines, felled them, and notched them with a saddle notch pattern. The work was hard, but familiar. The logs were green, but he had no time to let them season. The chinking was a hurried mix of mud and dry grass, stuffed between the gaps. And then, the fireplace. He'd built it on the west wall, the windward side, as he'd been told, to break the wind. Weeks. It was a colossal thing, 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep, built from stones pulled from the creek bed. It was a matter of pride. A big hearth meant prosperity, a symbol of a man who could provide, who could keep the wilderness at bay with a mighty blaze. The failure was not immediate. The autumn was pleasant, the fire a cheerful companion. But when the first true blizzard of December descended, the cabin's flaws turned from inconveniences into mortal threats. The green logs began to shrink in the dry, cold air, opening up gaps in the walls. The mud chinking froze, cracked, and fell out in chunks. The wind no longer just knocked at the door. It screamed through the walls. But the fireplace was the true enemy. It was not a source of heat. It was a bellows, actively sucking the warmth from the room and replacing it with Arctic air. Elias tried to fight it. He hung a heavy buffalo hide over the cabin door. He re-chinked the walls with a desperate freezing slurry of snow and ash, a temporary fix that lasted only hours. He even tried to narrow the fireplace opening by leaning flat stones against it, but the smoke simply billowed back into the room, choking him, stinging his eyes. He found himself in a losing cycle. To stay warm, he had to build a larger fire. A larger fire, however, created a stronger draft up the chimney, which in turn pulled in more frigid air from outside. He was, in effect, trying to heat the entire Rocky Mountain range. His woodpile, a massive stack he'd been proud of in October, vanished. By February, he was forced to venture out in the middle of storms, his snowshoes sinking deep, to cut more wood. He was risking his life simply to feed the beast that was supposed to be protecting him. He was exhausted, constantly breathing smoke, and perpetually cold. He would sit huddled in his blankets, his mind dull from the cold, staring at the flames. "This ain't right," he muttered to the empty room. "This ain't how it's supposed to be." He had done everything by the book, everything the old-timers and the settlement guides said to do, and it was all wrong. The common wisdom was a fool's wisdom, designed for a different, gentler place. Here, in the high mountains, it was a death sentence. The spring thaw of 1847 was a reprieve. As the valley floor turned from white to green, Elias packed his mules and headed east, not back to Ohio, but to the trading post at Fort Laramie. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed answers. He sold his winter's meager catch of pelts and found himself nursing a lukewarm coffee in the post's main hall, a vast, smoky room dominated by yet another massive, inefficient fireplace. He sat apart, listening to the boasts and complaints of other trappers. They all spoke of the hard winter, of close calls, of lost stock. It was the same story, over and over. They blamed the wind, the snow, the bad luck. No one blamed the cabins, no one but him. It was then that a man sat down across from him. He was older, with a thick graying beard and a heavy accent Elias couldn't place. His name was Henrik Baumann, a German immigrant who had come west not for gold or furs, but for quiet. He had been a Kachelofenbauer in the Old World, a builder of tile stoves. He watched Elias staring at the fire with a look of pure contempt. "She is a hungry pig, ja?" Henrik said, his voice a low rumble. Elias grunted in agreement. "Eats a cord of wood and gives you smoke for thanks." Henrik nodded slowly, packing a short-stemmed pipe. "You build a fire to see by. You build a stove to live by. You Americans, you love to, how you say. Watch the fire. You want to see the flame. So you build a great hole in your wall and let the heat fly away like a bird." Elias turned, intrigued. "It's how it's done." "It is how it is wrongly done," Henrik countered. He pulled a piece of charcoal from his pocket, and to the postmaster's annoyance, began to draw on the rough-hewn wooden table. "Your fire. It goes straight up. Pfft." He drew a line. "All the heat. For the owls." He then drew a complex rectangular box. "In my land, the smoke must wait." He drew a series of winding serpentine lines inside the box. The smoke must take the long way home. It must climb, then fall, then climb again. And all this time it gives its warmth to the stone. The fire burns, yes, For 1 hour. Hot, small, but the stone. The stone is warm for the whole day. The stone heats the room. Elias stared at the drawing. Baffles. A convoluted path. But the smoke. The smoke, Henrik said, comes out the chimney cold. If your chimney is hot, you are heating the sky. A fool's errand. You must heat the mass. He tapped the drawing. You heat the stone. The stone heats the room. All day, all night, from one small fire. That conversation was a revelation. It rearranged Elias's entire understanding of the world. He'd been focused on the fire, the source. Henrik focused on the heat, the result. On his long ride back to his valley, Elias saw the world differently. He noticed how the south-facing slopes shed their snow first. He observed how the rocks near a hot spring stayed warm long after the sun had set. He was no longer just a trapper. He was a man with a problem, and now, the beginning of a plan. Elias Thorne returned to his valley in the late summer of 1847 with a new, almost fanatic, focus. He did not unpack his traps. He left his rifle leaning by the door of the old, cold lean-to. He spent the first week just sitting, watching. He watched the sun's path from dawn to dusk, marking its angle with sticks driven into the ground. He watched the prevailing winds, tying strips of buckskin to a pine branch to see how the air moved through the small clearing. He was not just sighting a cabin, he was sighting a system. He finally chose a spot about 50 yards from his first cabin, on a slight rise of granite, with a clear southern exposure and a thick stand of pines to the north that would serve as a natural windbreak. Then he began to plan. For days he didn't lift a tool. He sat with a piece of charred wood in the flat, cured surface of a large deer hide, sketching, erasing, and sketching again. He was designing from the inside out. His father had taught him to build the walls first, then add the hearth. Elias was starting with the hearth. It would not be on a wall. It would be in the absolute center of the cabin. A massive column of stone that would, in effect, be the heart, the anchor, and the structural support for the entire building. He was a woodsman, but this new plan required him to become a stonemason. His most prized possession, a tool he had carried but seldom used, was his grandfather's stonemason's hammer. It was a solid, balanced tool, with one square face for striking and a sharp, chisel-like peen for shaping. He held it in his hand, feeling its weight, a connection to a craft he barely knew. He knew he could not get fire brick. He was hundreds of miles from any such luxury. He would have to find his own. He spent 2 weeks prospecting, not for gold, but for stone and clay. He found a vein of soapstone by the upper creek, a soft, dense rock he could carve with his axe and the hammer. He remembered Henrik mentioning soapstone. It held heat like no other. He found his clay in a cut bank by the river, a thick, greasy, blue-gray deposit. He mixed samples of it with sand, with fine gravel, with shredded grass, forming small bricks and firing them in his cooking fire, testing their strength, seeing which mix would resist cracking. He was no longer a trapper in a hurry. He was a craftsman obsessed. His plan was a hybrid of Henrik's Kachelofen and his own frontier limitations. He designed a small, deep firebox, lined with the best soapstone. From this box, the hot gas would not go up. It would go down a channel, then turn 180 degrees, and rise up a second flue, then cross over the top and go down a third, before finally exiting into a small, modest chimney pipe that would extend through the roof. The smoke, he calculated, would have to travel nearly 30 feet, all of it inside the stone mass. The mass itself would be a monster, a solid column 5 feet square at its base and tapering to the roof, built of river stone, soapstone, and his homemade clay sand mortar. He designed shelves into its sides, places to warm boots, to dry hides, to proof bread. He sketched the cabin walls around this central core. The stove would be the only partition, separating a small sleeping area from a larger living and working space. The walls would be double thick, 2 layers of logs with a 6-inch gap between, which he planned to pack with dried moss and grass for insulation. The windows would be small, few, and fitted with thick wooden shutters that could be barred from within. He was building a fortress against the cold. His old neighbor Jedediah, who trapped the next valley over, rode through. He saw Elias digging the massive, deep foundation for the stove, a pit 5 feet deep filled with heavy gravel for drainage. He saw the piles of sorted stone, the test bricks. "Building a tomb, Thorn?" "Yui," Jedediah asked, spitting tobacco. "Or maybe a bake oven for a giant?" Elias just wiped the sweat and clay from his face. "I'm building," he said, "a way to wake up warm." Jedediah shook his head and rode on, laughing. The work consumed him. The short, bright days of autumn became a race against the sun, a battle against his own fatigue. The heaviest labor was not the logs, but the stone. He felled a tall pine and cut it into rollers, using his mules to drag the largest soapstone slabs and granite boulders from the creek bed to his building site. Each stone was a victory. He built the foundation for the central stove first, a massive dry-stacked pyramid of gravel and rock that rose to the level of the cabin floor. This, he knew, was critical. The stove must not sink or heave with the frost. It had to be anchored to the mountain itself. Then, with the first snows already dusting the high peaks, he began the slow, precise work of the stove's core. He laid the firebox with his best-carved pieces of soapstone, fitting them tight. His hands, calloused from the axe handle, were soon raw and bleeding from the abrasive stone and the wet, alkaline clay mortar. He used his grandfather's hammer to chip, shape, and dress each stone, making it fit. The tink, tink, tink of the hammer was the only sound in the valley. The baffles were the most difficult part. He was building a 3-dimensional puzzle, a labyrinth for smoke, and it had to be perfect. A leak would mean a cabin full of smoke. A collapse would be catastrophic. He built the downdraft channel first, lining it with flat stones. Then the updraft right beside it. He had to let each section of the clay mortar cure for a day, slowing the work. He'd build a small fire outside the cabin to keep his mortar from freezing at night. He built the log walls concurrently, a double wall. He notched the logs to fit tightly around the rising stone column. As the walls rose, he stopped to pack the space between them with armloads of dry moss he'd spent a week gathering from the north side of trees. It was tedious, suffocating work, but he knew it was as important as the stove. He was building an envelope. The roof was last. He used thick log rafters, again tying them into the central stone column, which now poked through the roof line like a fortress tower. He sheathed the roof in thick pine boards, and then, in a stroke of inspiration, covered that with a thick layer of his clay-sand mixture, a sod roof without the sod, before adding a final layer of split pine shakes. He was waterproofing and insulating in a single step. By the time the first real snow of November began to fall, the structure was complete. It was squat, solid, and strange. It looked more like a blockhouse than a cabin. The windows were mere slits, the door a heavy, double-thick plank. The chimney was a narrow 6-inch pipe, looking comically small. Jedediah passed by again, this time with his winter's supplies. He looked at the cabin, then at Elias. "You've built yourself a fine-looking prison, Thorn. Hope you got enough air in there to breathe." Elias just nodded, his face grim with exhaustion. He hadn't built the first fire yet. He was terrified. He'd spent his entire season, all his strength, on a German's charcoal sketch and a trapper's intuition. If it failed, he wouldn't have time to build again. He wouldn't have the strength. The test came in the second week of January. For a month, the weather had been cold but manageable. Elias had used the stove, and it had worked. Differently. He built a fire as Henrik had instructed, small, hot, and fast. He'd use a single armload of his driest, split aspen. The fire would roar in the small firebox for an hour, a sound like a forge. Then, he would shut the iron damper he'd salvaged, sealing the firebox tight. The fire would die. The cabin would be silent. And then, slowly, the warmth would begin. It was a different kind of warmth. Not the scorching, drafty heat of his old fireplace, but a deep, radiant, pervasive warmth, like sunlight. The stone mass, all 10 tons of it, would heat up to the temperature of a fresh cup of coffee, and it would stay that way. For hours. He would wake up in the morning, 12 hours after the fire was out, and the cabin would still be a comfortable 65 degrees, the stones still shedding their stored energy. His woodpile, which he had built just as large as the previous years, was barely touched. But this was just the prelude. The true test was coming. The sky turned a flat, bruised yellow. The wind died, and a terrifying stillness fell over the valley. Elias went outside. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, the moisture in his nostrils freezing instantly. He knew this sign. He checked his moss-packed walls, his shutters. He brought in an extra armload of wood, though he suspected he wouldn't need it. That night, the blizzard hit. It was not a storm, it was a physical assault. The wind screamed, a solid, tangible thing that sounded like 1,000 voices. It hit the small cabin with the force of a battering ram. The temperature plummeted to 30, then 40 below zero. Snow fell so thick it was not flakes, but a solid white-gray wall. Elias was inside his fortress. He lit his evening fire at 5 p.m. The stove roared for its hour, consuming its small meal of aspen. He shut the damper. He sat at his small table, mending a trap, and listened. He heard the wind. It was a terrifying, high-pitched shriek, but he could not feel it, not a single draft. The candle flame on his table did not flicker. He walked to the walls. The inner logs were cool but not cold. The moss insulation was working. He touched the stone of the stove. It was a solid, radiating pillar of warmth. He felt a profound sense of calm, of safety he had never known. He went to bed. He slept in his long johns, not in his heavy furs. He slept under a blanket, not buried in a pile of them. He woke the next morning. The wind was louder. The world outside was gone, vanished in a white fury. But inside the cabin, it was warm. The stones were still warm. The air was still. He did not need to build a fire. He made coffee, cooked his breakfast on a metal plate set against the stove's side. The cabin was 62 degrees. He waited until noon, simply to keep his routine, before burning his next small fire. The blizzard raged for 3 solid days. Elias lived in a warm, quiet, still cocoon. He read, he worked on his gear, he ate warm meals. He was not surviving, he was living. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The silence was as stunning as the noise had been. The world was a new creation, blue and white, buried under 8 feet of snow. Elias had to dig his way out through the roof, shoveling the snow from his heavy door. When he finally emerged, the sun on the snow was blinding. Later that day, he saw movement. It was Jedediah, on snowshoes, stumbling toward his cabin. His face was black with frostbite, his beard a solid mass of ice. Elias dragged him inside. Jedediah collapsed on the floor, shaking, his eyes wide with disbelief. It's warm," he stammered, looking around, his eyes searching for the fire. Where's the fire, Thorn?" Elias was heating a pot of broth on the side of the stove. "I built the fire this morning, Jed." Jedediah reached out a half-frozen hand and touched the warm stone. He looked from the stone to Elias, and his expression was one of absolute dawning comprehension. "My God, Thorn," he whispered. "You've done it. You've tamed the cold." Jedediah's visit was the first of many. His own cabin, built on the common-sense principle, had nearly killed him. The wind had ripped the chinking from his walls, and his massive fireplace had inhaled his woodpile in 2 days, leaving him to shiver in his bedrolls, slowly freezing. He stayed with Elias for a week, recuperating, his initial mockery replaced by a quiet, profound respect. He studied the stone stove with the intensity of a convert. He asked questions. He watched the ritual of the small, hot fire. He felt the enduring, gentle heat. "You'll have to teach me," he said, his voice raw from the cold. "I will," Elias said. "But we're not building a new stove. We're rebuilding your fireplace." The next summer, Elias and Jedediah worked together. They couldn't move Jedediah's hearth, but they could change it. They rebuilt the inside, narrowing the opening and lining it with soapstone. They built a crude baffle system, a smoke shelf, and a secondary flue, forcing the heat to take a longer way home, as Henrik had said. It wasn't as good as Elias's central stove, but it cut Jedediah's wood consumption by half and made his cabin livable. The knowledge began to spread, not as a blueprint, but as a set of principles. When a new family of settlers, the Pearsons, arrived in 1850, their wagon broken and winter approaching, Elias didn't just help them build. He guided them. He helped them site their cabin. He oversaw the construction of its stone heart, a thorn stove, as Jedediah now called it. The Pearson cabin was warm all winter. Their children, who would have been in constant peril in a standard shack, were healthy. The idea spread down the valley. Men would come to see Elias's cabin. They would sit in the impossible warmth, their hands on the stone, and they would understand. The thorn stove became the vernacular of the valley. No two were identical. Each builder adapted the design to their materials and their cabin's layout. Some built with granite, some with sandstone. Some built complex baffles. Others just built a massive solid heat sink behind their firebox. But the core principle was the same. Stop heating the sky. Store the heat in the mass. By the 1860s, a man riding through that valley in winter could tell which cabins were built on the new principle and which were not. The old cabins had plumes of smoke belching from their chimneys, the snow melted off their roofs, and a desperate, frantic energy around them. The new cabins had only a thin, pale wisp of smoke for an hour in the morning. Their roofs were thick with insulating snow, and a sense of calm, quiet life emanated from them. Elias Thorne's innovation had fundamentally changed the equation of survival. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about time. Less time spent cutting wood meant more time for mending gear, for trapping, for hunting, for reinforcing the cabin, for living. It gave the settlers a margin of error, a buffer against the brutal calculus of the mountains. What Elias Thorne had done, driven by desperation and guided by an old German's wisdom, was to rediscover a set of fundamental physical laws. His secret trick was simply a brilliant intuitive application of thermodynamics. The standard walk-in fireplace was a catastrophe of design. It relied on radiant heat, but only the heat that sprayed directly from the flames. Its massive, open flue created a powerful convection current that pulled in more cold air than the fire could ever hope to warm, resulting in a net loss of heat for the building. Its efficiency was, at best, 10%. All the energy in the wood, the BTUs, as a later generation would call them, was going straight to the owls. Elias's stove, on the other hand, was an entire system. The first part of its genius was combustion. The small soapstone-lined firebox with its controlled damper got incredibly hot. This intense heat didn't just burn the wood, it burned the smoke itself, achieving a secondary combustion of the volatile gases. This process extracted far more energy from the same amount of fuel, and, as a byproduct, produced almost no creosote, making the chimney safer. The second part was heat exchange. The winding 30-foot path of the baffles was a masterpiece of efficiency. The hot gases, which in a normal chimney would be 600 degrees, were forced to slow down, to tumble, to spend time against the stone. By the time the smoke finally exited Elias's narrow chimney pipe, it was cool to the touch. He had robbed it of all its energy. He had kept the heat. The final and most important principle was thermal mass. The 10 tons of stone acted as a heat battery. Stone is slow to warm up, but it is also slow to cool down. Elias's stove stored the quick, intense energy of that 1-hour fire, and then radiated it back into the room for the next 12 or even 24 hours. He had decoupled the actad of burning from the experience of warmth. He was no longer a slave to the fire, feeding it every hour. He was its master, charging his battery at his own convenience. He had, in effect, created a passive, low-tech, 19th-century central heating system. It was the same principle that ancient Romans had used in their hypocausts, and that Russian pech stoves had used for centuries. It was a piece of ancient, evolved wisdom, brought to the American frontier, where it was desperately needed. Elias Thorne, without a day of formal schooling in physics, had become a brilliant practical engineer. Elias Thorne lived in that valley for another 40 years. He never grew rich. He never sought fame. He just endured. He watched the valley change, saw the railroad come through, watched the beaver trade die and the ranching trade begin. He became a fixture, a piece of the landscape, known as the Old Man of the Warm Cabin. His cabin became a way station, a refuge. Trappers, settlers, and even Ute hunting parties knew that in the worst blizzard, there was a place in Elias Thorne's valley where the air was still and the stones were always warm. He died in his sleep in the winter of 1891 in the cabin he had built, warmed by the stove he had designed. The cabin stood for another 50 years, a silent testament to its builder, before a forest fire finally claimed the valley. But the Thorne stoves in the other cabins, the lessons he had taught, outlived him by generations. His grandfather's stonemason's hammer, its wooden handle worn to a polished sheen, its steel head chipped and battered from 1,000 stones, was found in the ashes, the only thing besides the stove's core to survive the blaze. Elias's solution was not about more power or a bigger fire. It was about less waste. In a world of brutal scarcity, he had created abundance, not by finding more wood, but by finding a way to use all of the wood. He had learned to separate the fire from the heat, keeping the heat and letting the fire go. He proved that survival was not a matter of brute force, of fighting the wilderness. It was a matter of clever design, of working with the laws of nature. It was a lesson in efficiency, but also in patience. The stone, like wisdom, took time to heat up, but once warm, it held its comfort long after the flames were gone. True preparation is not about hoarding fuel for a crisis. It is about building a system so efficient that the crisis itself, the biting cold, the desperate scramble, never truly begins. It is about understanding that the right design does not just make life easier, it makes life possible.